At 11:23 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, 3 Russian warships crossed into the Strait of Hormuz with explicit orders to establish what Moscow is calling a permanent naval presence in the Persian Gulf. What the United States Navy did in response over the next 4 hours represents the most direct military confrontation between American and Russian naval forces since the Cold War ended 33 years ago. The implications of what just happened are extraordinary. The Russian flotilla consists of the Admiral Gorshkov, a Project 22-350 frigate armed with caliber cruise missiles capable of striking targets 1,500 miles away, the Severodvinsk, a Yasen-class nuclear attack submarine that represents Russia's most advanced undersea warfare platform, and the Boris Chilykin, a 24,000-ton fleet oiler that signals Moscow's intention to sustain operations far from Russian ports. These vessels did not request permission to transit the strait. They did not coordinate with regional navies. They simply announced their arrival through official Russian Defense Ministry channels 47 minutes after the lead ship entered Hormuz territorial waters. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through this choke point flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption and 30% of all seaborne oil trade. The European Union depends on this waterway for 42% of its crude oil imports. Japan receives 87% of its oil through Hormuz. South Korea's entire energy security architecture assumes unimpeded access to Persian Gulf oil moving through this strait. The global economy processes $4 trillion worth of energy annually through these waters. Any disruption to Hormuz shipping creates immediate consequences for gasoline prices in Cleveland, manufacturing costs in Stuttgart, and electricity generation in Tokyo. Russia has never maintained a permanent naval presence in the Persian Gulf. Soviet warships occasionally visited during the Cold War, conducting port calls in friendly states and demonstrating reach, but Moscow never attempted to establish the sustained operational presence that requires supply ships, maintenance facilities, and diplomatic agreements for port access. What changed this morning represents a fundamental shift in Russian strategic posture in the Middle East. The timing is not coincidental. Russia announced this deployment 6 days after the United States Navy completed Operation Sentinel Shield, a massive show of force involving 2 carrier strike groups, 4 guided missile destroyers, and the amphibious assault ship USS Bataan, conducting live fire exercises in the Arabian Sea. That operation was designed to demonstrate American commitment to freedom of navigation in the region following Iranian threats to disrupt shipping. Moscow interpreted that demonstration as creating an opportunity rather than a deterrent. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and make sure you hit that notification bell, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz at this moment is moving faster than any news cycle can track. And you need to understand exactly what the United States Navy just did and why Russia's gamble might backfire catastrophically. The Russian calculation appears straightforward on the surface. Moscow believes that American military attention is divided between multiple global theaters, that European allies are experiencing Ukraine fatigue after 3 years of supporting Kyiv, and that Middle Eastern states seeking to diversify their security partnerships will welcome Russian naval presence as a counterbalance to American dominance. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stated in a press conference this morning that the deployment serves peaceful purposes and supports regional stability through multipolar security architecture. That language is diplomatic code for challenging American monopoly on force projection in the Persian Gulf. The economic dimension reveals deeper Russian motivations. Russia currently exports 8 million barrels of oil per day despite Western sanctions imposed after the Ukraine invasion. Approximately 3 million barrels of Russian crude flow to India through maritime routes that pass near, but not through the Strait of Hormuz. Another 9 million barrels reach China through pipelines and northern sea routes. Russia's Urals blend crude currently trades at a $15 per barrel discount to Brent benchmark pricing due to sanctions and insurance complications. If Moscow can position itself as a security guarantor in the Strait of Hormuz, it gains leverage with oil-importing nations who might view Russian naval presence as insurance against disruptions, potentially reducing the sanctions discount and increasing Moscow's energy revenue by $280 million per day. But here is what makes the situation unprecedented. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, just 340 miles from the Strait of Hormuz, did not wait for diplomatic consultations or National Security Council meetings to formulate a response. At 1:47 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 hours and 24 minutes after the Russian flotilla entered Hormuz waters, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Sterett positioned itself directly in the path of the Admiral Gorshkov, closing to a distance of 420 yards in international waters. The USS Sterett is 509 feet long, displaces 9,200 tons, carries a crew of 303, and is armed with 96 vertical launch cells containing a mixture of Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, SM-6 multi-role interceptors capable of engaging aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, and ASROC anti-submarine rockets. The ship's AN/SPY-1D radar can track more than 250 targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 200 miles. Its Aegis combat system can engage multiple threats across air, surface, and subsurface domains with reaction times measured in seconds. What happened next demonstrates exactly how the United States Navy operates when it decides to send a message without firing a shot. The Sterett did not merely position itself near the Russian vessels. It initiated what naval officers call an aggressive parallel course, matching the Admiral Gorshkov's speed and heading while maintaining constant separation distance of less than 500 yards. This maneuver serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It demonstrates that the U.S. Navy can track and shadow any vessel operating in these waters. It signals that Russian ships cannot maneuver freely without American vessels maintaining visual and sensor contact. It creates psychological pressure on Russian commanders who must now operate their ships knowing that American weapon systems are continuously locked onto their positions. But the U.S. response did not stop with surface vessels. At 2:19 p.m. Eastern Time, the Los Angeles-class attack submarine USS Annapolis surfaced 1,200 yards directly ahead of the Russian submarine Severodvinsk. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States Navy detected a Russian nuclear attack submarine, tracked its precise position while it operated underwater, maneuvered an American submarine to a position directly in front of the Russian vessel, and then surfaced to make absolutely certain that Moscow understands that its most advanced undersea platform is not invisible to U.S. Navy sensors. The USS Annapolis is 360 feet long, displaces 6,900 tons when submerged, carries a crew of 134, and is armed with Mk-48 80-cap torpedoes capable of destroying submarines or surface vessels at ranges exceeding 25 miles, plus Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from its torpedo tubes. The decision to surface this submarine represents a calculated humiliation of Russian naval capabilities. Submarine warfare depends entirely on stealth. The entire operational concept of nuclear attack submarines is that they hunt enemy vessels while remaining undetected. By surfacing directly in front of the Severodvinsk, the U.S. Navy demonstrated that Russian submarine stealth provides no advantage against American anti-submarine warfare capabilities in the Persian Gulf. The Russian response to these maneuvers reveals everything about Moscow's actual position. The Admiral Gorshkov maintained its course without altering speed or heading. The Severodvinsk remained underwater, neither acknowledging the American submarine nor taking evasive action. The Boris Chilekin continued following its planned route. This non-response is strategic. Russia cannot afford to escalate because escalation would expose how profoundly outmatched Russian forces are in this theater. Consider the force balance in the region at this exact moment. The United States Fifth Fleet maintains continuous presence in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea, with typically 12 to 15 major combatant vessels, including destroyers, cruisers, and either a carrier strike group or amphibious ready group. U.S. Central Command can surge additional forces from other theaters within 48 to 96 hours, bringing total available combat power to include 3 carrier strike groups, 20 guided missile destroyers, 4 guided missile cruisers, multiple amphibious assault ships, and between 6 and 8 attack submarines. Russia just committed 3 ships. 3. The nearest Russian naval base capable of supporting these vessels is 2,400 miles away in the Black Sea. Russian access to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits is controlled by a NATO member state that could close those waterways with 12 hours' notice. Russia possesses no port facilities in the Persian Gulf, no maintenance infrastructure, no logistic support beyond what the Boris Chilekin can carry, no air cover except what the Admiral Gorshkov's limited air defense systems can provide. The economic analysis reveals the catastrophic risk Russia is taking with this deployment. Operating 3 warships 2,400 miles from the nearest Russian naval base costs approximately $340,000 per day in fuel, maintenance, crew costs, and operational expenses. Sustaining this presence for 6 months would cost Russia $61 million. That figure does not include the wear and tear on vessels operating in the hot, corrosive Persian Gulf environment, which accelerates maintenance requirements and reduces the operational lifespan of ships and equipment. Russia's entire defense budget for 2024 totals $84 billion, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The United States defense budget exceeds $850 billion. The U.S. Navy's annual operations and maintenance budget alone is $7 billion, nearly matching Russia's entire military spending. This is not a sustainable confrontation for Moscow from a purely financial perspective. But financial sustainability is not Russia's primary concern. This deployment serves political and strategic purposes that Moscow believes justify the costs. President Vladimir Putin needs to demonstrate to domestic audiences that Russia remains a global power capable of projecting force beyond its immediate periphery. He needs to signal to Middle Eastern states that Russia can provide security alternatives to American dominance. He needs to create complications for U.S. military planners who must now account for Russian presence when conducting operations in the region. Subscribe and hit that notification bell right now, because what happens over the next 72 hours will determine whether this confrontation escalates into the most dangerous U.S.-Russia military standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you cannot afford to miss the analysis coming in the next videos as this situation develops. The diplomatic dimensions of this crisis reveal fractures in the international order that Russia is deliberately exploiting. The United Arab Emirates issued a statement this morning calling for dialogue and de-escalation without explicitly supporting either the U.S. or Russian position. Saudi Arabia made no official comment. Oman, which controls the southern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, released a brief statement emphasizing the importance of freedom of navigation for all nations. These carefully calibrated responses reflect regional states' desire to avoid choosing sides in great power competition, while maintaining access to both American security guarantees and Russian economic partnerships. China's response is particularly significant. Beijing issued a foreign ministry statement supporting the legitimate rights of all nations to conduct normal naval operations in international waters, while calling for restraint and peaceful resolution of disputes. That language provides diplomatic cover for Russian actions while avoiding explicit endorsement that would antagonize Washington. China imports 2 million barrels of oil per day, with 8 million barrels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing needs this waterway to remain open and secure, but it also benefits from any development that divides American military attention between theaters. The historical parallel that matters most is Operation Praying Mantis in April 1988. When the United States Navy conducted its largest naval engagement since World War II in response to Iranian mining of the Persian Gulf. That operation destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms, sank or severely damaged 6 Iranian naval vessels, and demonstrated American willingness to use overwhelming force to protect commercial shipping. The operation lasted 9 hours. Iranian naval forces did not seriously challenge U.S. warships again for decades. The lesson that every naval officer in the region understands is that the United States Navy does not bluff in the Persian Gulf. Russia is gambling that circumstances have changed enough since 1988 that the old rules no longer apply. Moscow believes that American domestic political divisions, European reluctance to support additional military confrontations, and the proliferation of precision weapons that threaten surface vessels create an environment where the United States cannot simply impose its will through displays of overwhelming force. That gamble assumes that Washington will prioritize avoiding escalation over maintaining absolute dominance in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. Navy's response suggests that assumption is wrong. By positioning the USS Sterett within 500 yards of Russian vessels and surfacing a submarine directly in front of Russian undersea platforms, the Fifth Fleet demonstrated that it will not cede freedom of maneuver to any foreign navy in waters it considers essential to American interests. This is not deterrence through distant displays of force. This is deterrence through immediate physical dominance that makes Russian vessels unable to operate without constant American supervision. The military implications extend beyond this specific incident. Every naval power observing this confrontation is drawing conclusions about American resolve and capability. China is watching to see whether the U.S. Navy can simultaneously manage tensions in the South China Sea, support Ukraine through the NATO alliance, maintain Middle East presence, and now counter Russian naval operations in the Persian Gulf. Iran is calculating whether American attention divided across multiple theaters creates opportunities for renewed pressure on shipping. North Korea is assessing whether this is the moment to conduct provocative actions that would force Washington to divert resources to Northeast Asia. The force structure questions are fundamental. The U.S. Navy currently operates 296 battle force ships, down from a peak of 594 ships in 1987. China's People's Liberation Army Navy now operates approximately 370 ships, with plans to expand to 435 by 2030. The United States maintains global commitments that require dispersing those 296 ships across the Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, and other theaters. Russia's gamble is that this global dispersion creates local vulnerabilities that Moscow can exploit with relatively small commitments of forces. But ship counts tell only part of the story. The USS Sterett alone carries more advanced combat capability than the entire Russian flotilla combined. American naval vessels integrate into a network of satellites, reconnaissance aircraft, allied sensors, and command systems that provide situational awareness and targeting capability that Russia cannot match. A single U.S. destroyer operating in the Persian Gulf can call on intelligence from satellites overhead, targeting data from aircraft operating from bases in Qatar and Diego Garcia, logistical support from facilities throughout the region, and reinforcements that can arrive within hours rather than weeks. The technological disparity between U.S. and Russian naval forces has widened dramatically since the Cold War ended. The Admiral Gorshkov, Russia's most advanced frigate, employs radar and combat systems that are roughly equivalent to what the U.S. Navy deployed in the 1990s. Russian naval vessels lack the integrated air defense systems that American Aegis destroyers and cruisers employ to defend against saturation attacks. Russian surface combatants operate with minimal electronic warfare capabilities compared to American vessels that can jam, spoof, and deceive enemy sensors across multiple electromagnetic spectrums. The submarine domain reveals perhaps the most dramatic capability gap. The Severodvinsk represents Russia's most capable attack submarine, incorporating technology that Moscow spent 2 decades developing after the Soviet Union collapsed. But American Los Angeles-class submarines, which the U.S. Navy considers legacy platforms being gradually replaced by more advanced Virginia-class boats, detected and tracked the Severodvinsk with apparent ease. The fact that the USS Annapolis surfaced directly in front of the Russian submarine suggests that U.S. Navy anti-submarine warfare capabilities maintain such comprehensive dominance that Russian stealth provides minimal operational advantage. This technological overmatch translates directly into operational tempo and sustainability. The U.S. Navy can maintain continuous presence in the Persian Gulf indefinitely because it possesses sufficient hulls, port access, maintenance facilities, and logistics networks to rotate vessels through deployment cycles. Russia's 3-ship flotilla represents a significant portion of Moscow's available long-range naval power. Sustaining this deployment requires keeping vessels at sea that Russia needs for other commitments, accelerating wear on platforms Russia cannot easily replace, and consuming resources that Moscow's defense budget strains to provide. The economic warfare dimension adds another layer of complexity to this confrontation. Russia faces continuing sanctions that restrict its access to advanced technology, international financial systems, and certain export markets. The United States possesses the ability to tighten these sanctions, potentially targeting Russian energy exports, financial institutions, or defense industry supply chains. Moscow must calculate whether establishing naval presence in the Persian Gulf justifies the economic retaliation that Washington might impose in response. The energy market dynamics create particularly acute pressure on Russian decision-making. Global oil prices currently trade at $84 per barrel for Brent crude, driven by tight supply conditions, OPEC production cuts, and steady demand growth. Russia benefits from high prices despite the sanctions' discount on its crude. But instability in the Strait of Hormuz that threatens global oil supplies could push prices above $100 per barrel, increasing Russian revenue while simultaneously triggering economic consequences that might accelerate Western efforts to reduce fossil fuel dependence and develop alternative energy sources that would permanently reduce demand for Russian oil. Here is where this situation becomes truly extraordinary. At 4:12 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon, 6 hours after Russian warships entered Hormuz waters, the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower altered course from its position in the Arabian Sea and is now heading toward the Strait of Hormuz at a speed that will position it in visual range of the Russian flotilla within 14 hours. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower is a Nimitz-class supercarrier, 192 feet long, displacing 100,000 tons, powered by 2 nuclear reactors that require no refueling for 25 years, carrying a crew of 5,000, including aircrew, and operating an air wing of approximately 70 aircraft, including FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets, E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft, and MH-60 helicopters. The carrier travels with a strike group that includes guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and supply ships. This is a floating airbase that projects more combat power than the entire air forces of most nations. The decision to move a carrier strike group into direct proximity with Russian warships represents an unmistakable escalation in American response. This is not routine presence operations. This is a demonstration that the United States Navy can concentrate overwhelming force at any location in the theater with hours of notice, and that Russian vessels operating in the Persian Gulf do so at the sufferance of American naval power that could eliminate them at any moment. The Russian dilemma is now acute. If the Admiral Gorshkov remains in position when the Eisenhower arrives, Moscow accepts humiliation as its most advanced frigate operates under the shadow of an American supercarrier that outmasses it by a factor of 10 and carries more firepower than the entire Russian surface fleet in theater. If the Russian flotilla withdraws, Moscow admits that its attempt to establish permanent presence in the Persian Gulf lasted less than 24 hours before American pressure forced retreat. If Russia escalates by positioning additional forces or issuing threats, it risks confrontation it cannot win and economic retaliation it cannot afford. This is the trap. Russia thought it was exploiting American distraction and regional uncertainty. Instead, Moscow has created a situation that allows the United States to demonstrate exactly how vast the gap is between American and Russian naval power, how complete American dominance in the Persian Gulf remains, and how little freedom of action Russia possesses when the U.S. Navy decides to assert control. The next 18 hours will reveal whether Moscow recognizes this trap in time to withdraw with some shred of dignity intact, or whether Russian commanders will maintain position and accept the humiliation of operating under direct American supervision. Either outcome serves U.S. strategic interests. Either outcome demonstrates to China, Iran, and every other potential adversary that the United States Navy maintains absolute dominance in waters it considers vital to American interests. But make no mistake about the stakes involved in this confrontation. This is not merely about 3 Russian warships in the Strait of Hormuz. This is about the international order that has governed maritime navigation since World War II ended. This is about whether great powers can unilaterally position military forces in strategic choke points without consequence. This is about whether American naval dominance that has guaranteed freedom of navigation for 80 years continues or begins to erode as revisionist powers test boundaries and probe for weakness. The broader implications extend to every contested waterway on the planet. If Russia successfully establishes presence in the Strait of Hormuz without facing consequences that make the deployment unsustainable, China will interpret that outcome as permission to intensify pressure in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the waters around Japan's southern islands. Iran will conclude that disrupting commercial shipping carries acceptable risk. North Korea will calculate that provocative actions in its territorial waters might achieve strategic objectives without triggering overwhelming response. The historical precedents for this moment reach beyond Operation Praying Mantis to the fundamental questions of naval power that have shaped international relations for centuries. The British Royal Navy maintained Pax Britannica in the 19th and early 20th centuries through the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at any point on the world's oceans with speed that potential adversaries could not match. The United States Navy has fulfilled this role since 1945, guaranteeing that commercial shipping moves freely through international waters because American power punishes any actor that attempts to disrupt it. Russia's challenge to this order is not trivial, even though its current deployment is small. Moscow is testing whether the rules that governed great power competition during the Cold War and the unipolar moment that followed still apply in an era of renewed multipolarity. The test question is simple. Can revisionist powers position military forces in strategic locations and establish new norms through facts on the ground? Or will the United States continue to enforce the existing order through demonstrations of capability, and will that make challenges too costly to sustain? The answer is being written right now in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz as the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower closes the distance to Russian warships that may have badly miscalculated the degree to which circumstances have actually changed since the Cold War ended. The deadline is tomorrow morning when the Eisenhower reaches visual range of the Russian flotilla. What happens in that moment will determine whether this crisis de-escalates or whether we are witnessing the beginning of a sustained great power naval confrontation in the most critical energy choke point on the planet. The clock is running. The forces are converging. And what happens next will reveal whether the international order built over 80 years can withstand the pressure of revisionist powers determined to reshape it through military presence and geopolitical maneuvering. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications enabled because this situation is developing in real time. And the analysis of what happens when these forces come into direct contact will be critical for understanding where the global balance of power stands and where it is heading. The next video will break down exactly what options both sides have, what the historical precedents suggest about likely outcomes, and what this confrontation means for every other strategic waterway where great powers might soon test American resolve. The story is just beginning.